Welcome to Safe on Deck. For episode 48, I sat down with Captain Ryan Cobb in Pensacola, Florida. Captain Cobb was commissioned as a second lieutenant following graduation from the Air Force Academy in May of 2011. And upon graduation of Combat Systems Officer training, he was selected to fly as a navigator aboard the iconic KC-135 RT Stratotanker. Captain Cobb completed 7 deployments to Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where he flew over 200 combat sorties and 1,700 combat hours as a Special Operations Air Refueling low-level aerial tanking navigator, flying in support of Air Force Special Operations aircraft. Additionally, Captain Cobb completed a deployment to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan as the tanker liaison for Combined Joint Special Operations Air Component Afghanistan and Joint Special Operations Air Directorate Iraq. Next, Captain Cobb was handpicked to transition to Air Force Special Operations Command and the U-28A Draco at Cannon Air Force Base and Hurlburt Field, where he deployed to 3 separate AORs in support of Special Operations Command missions. Captain Cobb most recently returned from his 11th deployment in support of a crisis response mission in U.S. Southern Command. Captain Cobb currently serves as one of the initial cadre of weapons systems officers flying the Air Force's newest close air support platform, the OA-1K Skyraider II. Captain Cobb has logged over 3,000 hours in the KC-135 RT and the U-28A, and he is an avid general aviation pilot and certified flight instructor, and the proud owner of an immaculate Vans RV-8 named Satin Doll. Thanks, as always, for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, episode 48, with Captain Ryan Cobb. Enjoy. Ryan, start all these interviews the same way, so we'll start yours the same way as well. Where were you born?
I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I don't remember much. I moved away when I was 10, but, the foothills of the Appalachians. It was real pretty. And then when I was 10, we moved down to Memphis, Tennessee, which is really the town that I kind of call home that I remember, but flat and not pretty. Kind of fell in love with the culture there, the music especially, the blues and the soul and all that. Got really into that when I was a kid, but that's where I call home.
Very cool. So not hearing aviation yet. There's a little bit of aviation in Memphis, I guess FedEx and all that, but
oh yeah.
Yeah, where's the first touches with aviation for you?
That was my grandfather. He was a naval aviator, Corsair pilot. Tail end of World War II. He missed getting deployed to the Pacific. I believe he was underway on the Midway when they dropped the bomb. So he was, I think, still in territorial waters of the United States. And so the war ended. He stayed on, as far as we can tell from records, and he passed a few years ago, so it's kind of hard to figure it out, but we recently discovered all of his personnel records. As far as I could tell, he stayed in for about 2 years. He was part of Operation Frostbite, which was they took the Midway up to the Labrador Sea, I think it is, in the Arctic Circle, and they pretty much handed them survival gear, poopy suits and stuff like that, and said, just go do your thing, because they knew eventually someone was going to go in the drink or there was going to be a crash or something like that, and they were going to be able to test the survival equipment. That was their big project. He transitioned to the Naval Reserve at Point Columbus after that, flew the Navy's first jets, Furies, Panthers, and Cougars, I think, as well. We used to have this swing in the backyard. We called it a glider. I don't know what everyone else calls it, but it's like 2 benches that face one another, and you can push on the footrest on either side to swing back and forth. I used to sit on that, and he would run me through the startup and carrier launch checklist in the Corsair. So I used to have that memorized and then fly little combat sorties. And he's really the one who got me interested in it. I used to take him all my model airplanes and he would explain stuff about them to me. He's a mechanical engineer, so the apple fell way far from the tree with that one. I always say he taught me to fly before I ever left the ground. And unfortunately, I never got to fly with him. But originally, my designs were go into the Navy like Grandpa, go through the Naval Academy, and which he did not do. But that's what he always told me I should do. And I guess I took it. 3-year-old me really took that to heart. So.
But you found your way to the Air Force.
I did, yeah. I don't know how that one happened. I think it's a girlfriend's dad in high school who went to the Air Force Academy convinced me that it was a good idea. So, so I went to the Air Force Academy, graduated in 2011.
Tell me about the Academy.
It's a great place to be from, as they say.
I've heard that by other people say that, yes.
Yeah, it was good for me. Definitely needed the structure, I guess. But I've always been a little obsessive and a little single track minded. I enjoyed just being fully immersed in military and aviation culture all the time. Like, it's the center of my world. It's the center of the world of the academy. And so it seemed to work out. I actually didn't find it to be a particularly miserable experience, I guess. But that's where I really started flying for real too. Flying at the Aero Club there and the powered flight program and gliders and jump. I never thought I would jump out of an airplane. Turns out that was awesome. I would definitely do that again.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place too. I had the chance to visit on I forget what they call it, a college recruitment visit, basically.
Yeah.
And like most schools don't have their own airfield. Most schools don't have their
Right.
own ability to jump out of airplanes or
Right.
get towed behind other airplanes as a glider pilot. How does it work when you're at the academy? Is it like a summer program thing, or is it something you can do during the semester? I know absolutely nothing about it.
So I did soaring during my first summer there, first summer after my freshman year. They take you to solo during a 3-week summer program. Some guys did it during the school year. What ended up happening with me is I actually did fairly well in the soaring program, and I got picked up to become an instructor. So kind of the unknown secret about that is that all the instructors, with the exception of a few permanent party there, members of the actual squadron, all the instructors are cadets. So you've got 20 to 22-year-old kids teaching other kids how to fly. So I went through, and this is kind of my first brush with the struggle that has been my career so far, is I went through the instructor upgrade program, got to the very end, and had been selected for some other summer programs that following summer, and it cut my training off. And when I came back, I don't know if the Navy's this way, but the Air Force has very strict like syllabus rules. So like, here are how many rides there are in order to complete the program. Here's how many extra you could possibly get. And then after that, that's it. Too bad. And so I went back after the summer, and they were like, you get like a couple rides. Honestly, I'd struggled a little bit in the program, had used up some of those extra rides. And they're like, hey, I know you haven't flown for 6 weeks, but here's your check ride, go. And that check ride did not go well. So
Imagine that.
yeah. And so one day the squadron commander called me. He's like, hey, I think you could finish the program, but AETC says you're out of rides. So sorry. So that was my first smack in the face with how challenging aviation can be sometimes.
Just because it's, obviously I know the Navy background, Navy side of it. There's no waiver. There's no like, hey, here's a good reason why I might need this extra training or this extra little bit to get this knocked out. That's not really kind of a thing, I'm guessing.
They say there's a waiver for everything, right? And it's all about who's willing to put in the effort. And when you're one of 4,000 and the squadron commander doesn't know you from Adam, probably not worth his energy. I always tried to make the argument that you spent all this money so far.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I don't think that one flew either.
Gotcha. But leaving the academy, where'd you go next?
Actually, I went to Vance Air Force Base for undergraduate pilot training, which is where the next stumbling block came along.
Tell me about Vance.
Well, so before I got to Vance, I'd actually gotten my private pilot certificate, and I actually did it in an aerobatic aircraft, which is relevant because I got to Vance pretty confident that I was going to do okay. And then I took my first T6 ride. T6 rides are usually about an hour. Mine was about 35 minutes because I threw up the entire time. I have never been so violently airsick in my life. I've never been violently airsick in anything besides the T6. And for whatever reason, I don't know if it was G-suit mask and helmet, I don't know if it was the parallax on the bubble canopy, speed or G's or whatever, but I literally puked my way out of pilot training. It was so bad. I mean, they had me on drugs at one point to try and cure it. They grounded me for a super long time at one point to grind new lenses for my glasses because they thought maybe it was a vision thing. I have more hours in the Barony chair than I do in the T6, if you're familiar with the Barony chair.
Absolutely, yes. Spin and puke chair is what we call it.
Yeah, except you're not allowed to puke if you're in my situation.
Really?
Yeah, so what they do is they have you, so you get it's like a pain scale, but it's a nauseous scale, 0 being not nauseous at all, 10 being actively throwing up, right? They put you in the chair and they say, all right, you're gonna wear all your gear and you're gonna hold a checklist and we're gonna spin and you're gonna read from the checklist out loud. And then you're gonna put your head to the side and then you're gonna put your head to the other side. And then you're going to like look up, look down, moving your head, just screwing with your inner ear and having you read at the same time. They're like, when you get at a 7, let us know. And when you get to a 7, they stop. And then the next time they want you to get to an 8, and then they want you to get to a 9. Their hope is that eventually you never get that high again on the scale, but they wouldn't let you throw up, which is even worse because if you've ever been airsick before and thrown up, you pretty much feel better.
It clears it right out. Yeah.
If you don't, you feel sick the rest of the day.
Yep. Man, what an interesting way to do it.
Yeah. I spent 6 months in the T6 program and got about a third of the way through the syllabus. My classmates were finishing up the last phase of the T6 when I washed out finally. So the wing commander there asked me if I wanted to keep flying or if I wanted to go to do intel or personnel or security forces or anything like that. I said I'd do anything to stay in an airplane, and I didn't know it at the time, but a physiological was a waiverable condition to return to pilot training if you could demonstrate that you got over it I unknowingly painted myself into a corner when I said I wanted to go to CISO training, because if it's adaptability, if it's a physiological thing, then you can't go. So he ended up citing my reason for failure as SA and airmanship. And then that barred me from all branches of service training as a pilot for all time.
Wow.
Yeah, so he was trying to do me a solid, and I think
went the other way.
Yeah, I think it kind of went the other way.
Gosh.
But yeah, so that was man, it was a ride to get there too, because originally I wasn't medically qualified at all. I got my pilot slot the day before I graduated at the academy. I was originally going to go be, I think, RPAs. Yeah, I was originally slated to be an air battle manager, traded that to be an RPA pilot.
RPA is being drowned, just to make sure we unpack all the terms.
Sorry.
CISO, Combat Systems Officer. So we're talking about in the Navy, an NFO, WISO, Weapons Systems Officer, Naval Flight Officer, backseater, CSO, CISO in the Air Force.
Right. And the career field of CISO or CSO encompasses, they just jammed a whole bunch of career fields together. So EWO, Electronic Warfare Officer, Weapons Systems Officer, as you said, navigators, bombardiers, all that, they all just share one name.
I want you to tell your story. I want to kind of add a bit to it. And the only reason I mention that is I've had a lot of people ask me about the medical side of it. I can only speak to the way that we do things in the Navy. First off, if you have questions, literally it's called the NAMI Waiver Guide, NAMI, Naval Aviation Medical Institute, I think. You can look up, like, hey, if I have this vision with this astigmat, this correction, whatever, my lenses, whatever it might be, you can look it up and you can know the answer. Am I going to pass? Am I not going to pass? You can go to a doctor, hand them that and say, hey, am I in standards? Am I out of standards? This is a little bit kind of outside that. This is more of the judgment. If you could go back and how old were you when you went through this, going through Vance?
I was 22, so 22. Right out of college.
Okay, 22-year-old Ryan Cobb. If you could talk to him and say, hey man, here's what I would do differently with the benefit of time, and I'm fast forwarding a little bit. We're going to talk about the rest of your awesome career, obviously, but is there anything you would do differently or any advice you'd give to someone in that position that's kind of struggling? Putting you on the spot here, obviously.
Yeah, it's real easy to get bitter after something like that. And I think as we kind of talk more and unwrap kind of the rest of my life since, you'll see a theme here. I was so single-minded growing up. This is I built my entire identity in my life around, like, I am going to be a pilot. And then that was taken away by something that there was no bad guy. Like, there was no evil actor that screwed me over. It was just like nature. It was literally nature. It was just something biologically, which I still can't pin down. And so I guess my advice to myself would be, don't put all your eggs in one basket kind of thing. There's plenty of fulfilling things out there. It's not the end of the world when that one thing dies. That took a really long time for me to, like, get through my brain that, like, it's okay to not get the one thing you wanted your entire life.
Okay, so we talked about going to be a CISO next. Was that at Pensacola for the training? Or
It was.
Okay,
and it was after we had split from the Navy, so we weren't doing it with the Navy at that point anymore. It was an all Air Force program, but yeah, it was at NAS Pensacola.
Cool. So T6s and T1s down on the, I think it's the southern or western, one of the edges of the flight line there at Pensacola.
Yeah, it's right up against the water there on the south side. And it was T6s and T1s. And then we also had we spent a lot of time in a simulator. So at the time, you got a little bit of everything. I think they track select now, so they specialize a little earlier. But we went through, T6s, we just did contact phase, which is your aerobatics and stuff. Back then, we got formation rides, like 2 of them, I think, which is really neat because, there was very little for us to do. It was just familiarization. So normally you'd just pick 2 fighter guys and you would go dogfight. So that was great. Some low levels. And then you go into the sim, you do radar navigation without any kind of other nav aids. So it's just radar and an INS, basically an inertial navigation system.
What is that sim modeling? Is it modeling a specific airplane, a specific radar, or just something vague enough?
It was the flight characteristics of the T1, and then it was a hodgepodge of panels from different airplanes.
Really?
They could just port in and out, and every time you'd go into a new phase, it was like going to a new airplane, kind of, because you would have your nav suite or your weapons suite or whatever it was would get remodeled and stuff would move around a little. So when we went through the radar nav, we had a big C-130 radar screen, a terrain following radar like you would find on, I think it was an MC-130. And then when we went through electronic warfare stuff, you would get a pan scope like on an EC-130. More electronic warfare stuff was they modeled some of the rivet joint systems, SAM site locating, geolocation stuff. They had one of those. And then there was some B1 stuff that made it in there for bombing and low level and self-protect, chaff and flare, all came from the B1. And then we ended up with I think it's called a B scope, if I remember correctly, from the Strike Eagle. And so we did some air intercept training, and then we had a little missile system to go with it.
Very cool. The only reason I asked that question, I'm not a T-45 guy, not a VT-86 guy. For us on the Navy side, we do all the primary training at VT-10, but when they do advanced, they're going to go to the T-45.
Okay.
And the system we have is called the VMTS, and I'm going to probably butcher the acronym, Virtual Mission Training System.
Okay.
Basically what it is, in the back seat of the T-45s at VT-86. It's a baby F-18 cockpit. Those screens, the repeaters, it's tied to ground stations so they can throw threats in there and other aircraft, simulated of course.
Right.
The aircraft can talk to one another, they can talk to the ground station, but, and I'm just going to make up a number. Let's say, I don't know, a radar range is a 1.0, and then they get to the F-18 and it's a whatever classified number, but they're familiar with those symbologies in that system, and now it's just the numbers change. Our folks are only getting ready to be in an F-18 or a Growler.
Sure.
A little bit smaller pool as opposed to the Air Force. You have a lot more different systems you got to fly behind. So it kind of makes sense that it's done that way.
And we had a similar thing in the T1 as well. Really interesting concept because they essentially did, granted, everyone's a CISO, right? But essentially they had a navigator position who would sit right seat in the T1. Usually guys would just give us control of the autopilot. So you were flying the plane, which I wish I'd logged jet time out of that. But in the back, you had a panel that looked very much like a B-1's weapons station. And so you would fly a low level was the primary mission that we did in that. We did some high level instrument work too, but you would fly a low level mission with a guy up front navigating, chart clock ground. And then in the back, you would have a guy doing the WISO job and had a radar that was tied to like a JOG chart, I think, the Joint Operational Graphic, I think is what it's called.
I'm impressed you knew that. I barely could pull it out of my brain.
As a navigator.
Fair enough.
But it was modeled after that. It was they essentially took that chart and made it green scale. So it looked just like a radar, and but what it really was a moving map, right? It just made it appear like a radar. You could screw with the gain and stuff like that to create a clearer, better picture, and your instructor over to your left would be plugged in with a laptop, and they could drop threats in there. And then you had a chaff and flare button that didn't do anything, and you had a pan scope so you could do tactical jamming with it. And so the guy up front is like helping fly the plane, essentially. Is like, all right, time, distance, heading, and the guy in the back's hands are flying all over the place, taking care of threats. And then so the nav's got to get you to the target, and then you've got to confirm it with radar, and then you got to drop your bomb. And the system recorded the bomb drop and scored hits and everything. You
mentioned a term, and I just want to make sure I unpack it if we're even allowed to. A pan scope. I'm a dumb helo guy. What is a pan scope?
A pan scope graphically displays a frequency. So if you've ever seen the real old pan scopes, you see them in movies sometimes. It's like a little box that like computer nerds use or electricians or whatever. It's got a little circle in it with like a scope. The lines like a heartbeat monitor wave on it. You can identify a threat based on its signature that way if you're a really good EWO.
And that's something they're teaching you even at that, I'm going to call it primary level.
This was in the advanced phase of CISO. Yeah, it was later on in there. But
awesome.
Yes, you could. That was one of the things you had to know. And it's a little automated for like a tactical, like defensive systems in an airplane, kind of like raw gear. You would just see a frequency band that would pop up on, that's an SA6 in this band. So select it, hit the jam button on that frequency. But when we did the rivet joint stuff, we had to identify what the signal was by doing exactly that. So you would tease it out. You would use and this was a more real pan scope, like what you would see in the movies, where you're zooming in and out on the waveform to see what is the pulse repetition interval, what is the pulse repetition frequency, what is the actual frequency range. And we actually had to memorize pretty much the vol threat, the whole classified specs about these different radar systems. And then what you would do is you would take 3 bearing measurements, so you could, and where the lines intersect is where it's geolocated. So now you know where it is, and then you got to report to somebody, hey, there's a radar here. Incidentally, it's the fire control system for an SA6, and it's currently active. Honestly, I hated it.
I'm over here smiling and thinking that is the coolest thing ever, because that's how you find, fix, and finish these systems.
Yes.
You have to have that knowledge. You have to have someone with that knowledge.
So vital. Not my cup of tea.
Fair enough.
That was a rough time for me. I wasn't super happy to be there. I had kind of a crummy attitude. Just haven't watched it. And not that they should, but the Air Force doesn't give you like a mental health holiday or anything like that after. So they were just like, all right, off to training for you, round 2.
You mentioned that, though. Was there anyone there that, like, for example, we would call it a jacket review, maybe a student control officer, someone that saw your jacket and was like, hey, let's talk about, where you came from, where you're going next, what you're going to have to adjust when you're here with us. Is that a thing, or is that something that's maybe I don't know.
Maybe on an individual level, I'm sure that there are people out there that are that way. The CISO schoolhouse was a very different environment. And that's also kind of what, I probably walked into it a little prejudiced already, but man, I just, like, when I got to Vance and, I was engaged at the time, and one of the flight commanders there was, everyone goes in the dorms, right? I was just like, hey, I've got a fiance. She's like going to come stay with me pretty frequently. We're not married yet. We're not looking to get married yet. Do I really have to live in the dorms and get a hotel every single time that she comes out here? Like, I was like, no, dude. Here's your BAH. The entire program was like that. It was very, I called it bro level. Like it just operated on a very human level, and just different cultures, I guess. And when I came down here to Pensacola, it was very much the opposite. I had a major just come out and I was like, told him the same story, and he's like, yeah, but are you married? Well, no. All right, you're going to the dorms. And so I had to like dive into regulations about essentially the amount of stuff that I had acquired and about how it was going to cost the Air Force more to put it in long-term storage than to just pay me BAH. And I eventually won the argument. It was just a very different environment, and it felt a little colder. I don't know why. I don't know if it was just the pace that things move at, or that they were under the gun to produce CISOs.
We talk about taking care of our people, and just again, I'm interjecting my thoughts in your interview here. People are always worried about commander, a commodore in our case, or some higher level of leadership, the admiral. Just pick whatever person with something fancy on their card that you want to talk about. At the lower level, you can do so much for your people if you know them, if you ask, and if you care.
Oh, yeah.
And you talked about, bro level. Like, it really is that simple. And on the Navy side, I'd like to think I don't throw my rank around. I'm trying to think even in my brain here of an example of a time I've done it. The couple times I can think of, it wasn't for me, it was for someone else.
Sure.
And it felt great because it was like, you know what? Number one, I rent these. I don't own these. And number two, I'm not using them for me. I'm using them to take care of someone that works for me.
Right.
That person could have just as easily said, yeah, man, message received and understood. We're going to take care of you.
Yeah.
And then they chose not to.
Right.
And that's what you remember. That's what you're going to tell other people, right? And what a shame, what a missed opportunity. But also, like, I'm not going to judge. I wasn't in that person's shoes, but man, it could be better, right? And that's what I hope we all work towards, is taking care of one another.
Yeah, and I certainly don't. He has his marching orders as well, and I can't.
Exactly.
Maybe I was asking him to bend the rules for me or not. Maybe he wanted me to go through the exercise of like, hey man, if you're going to try and work the system, know the rules, and I had to go find him and I figured it out. So learning experience. That was pretty much it as far as CISO training goes.
Okay, so one thing I think that the Air Force does well, maybe the Navy doesn't do quite so well, is when you find out where you're going. So y'all call it drop night. It's not really a Navy tradition, Navy thing. I like to ask folks like how they found out, and I've literally had people tell me like someone slid a piece of paper across the desk and are like, hey, by the way, you're going to go fly F-18s. Like no fanfare whatsoever. What's it like on the Air Force side, and what was drop night like for you?
They keep your assignment a secret until the day that they're ready to release it officially, like until the day the order's signed, and that's a party is what it is. So you gather in the officers club, and it's kind of on your class to invent the procedure for how they're going to do it. So we had a flight commander early on who was warning us about being too individualistic in our training. And his catchphrase was, don't John Wayne it, which none of us knew what that meant. That's why you're looking at me that way now. What he meant was, don't try and go it alone. Don't be the lone cowboy, right? That naturally made its way onto a patch. It was frankly a stupid saying, and none of us understood what it meant without him having to explain it. If you got to explain your catchphrase, it's not very good, right? So that made it onto our patch. So we became kind of this hokey cowboy themed class because our patch literally had an image of John Wayne on it. Good quote though, life's tough. It's tougher when you're stupid. That's what the rockers said. So we had a Nerf gun cowboy action shooting contest with booze, of course. You and another member of your classmate, when it was your time to drop, would go up and you'd take a shot and turn around and fire a Nerf gun at a target. Whoever hit the target first. We had some really bad marksmen in that class. Marines, we are not. So we would shoot the target. Whoever shot the target first got their drop right away, and the other person had to get back in line. So yeah, and we all wore flight suits with Stetsons. So apologies to the F-15 squadron that actually issues Stetsons. I dropped the KC-135. At the time that I dropped the KC-135, I believe there were 54 navigators left in the entire fleet. There were 4 squadrons that had navigators, and they were all located at McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita, Kansas.
And why is that?
It was for a special mission. All the other tankers, and at McConnell as well, they cover pretty much every mission in the Air Force, right? Whether there's no special qualification for suppression of enemy air defenses or combat air patrol or, airdrop or, whatever you're tanking is just another airplane, right? Until you get into special operations. And so the KC-135 had a mission called SOAR, which is Special Operations Air Refueling, not to be confused with the venerable helicopter unit
that killed bin Laden.
Yeah, exactly.
The 160th up at Fort Campbell for those that,
right,
aren't giant nerds like you and I.
Special Operations Aviation Regiment.
That's the one, yeah.
So essentially what it is it's designed to support MC-130s and C-17s on infill and resupply missions. And if they're going to have to tank at some point, because some of these missions don't stop. They go continuously from their point of origin to the target and back, which means that they need a tanker usually on the front and back end. The C-17 is some exception depending on how low they're flying.
It's just a function of gas burn. The lower you fly, the more gas you burn. C-17, even though it's a flying gas can, I'm sure, at a certain point you need gas.
Yes, so. I have never refueled a C-17 in the wild. It was always for training. My understanding is they could literally circle the globe without refueling.
That's an incredible, wow, yeah.
Yeah, it's a monster for sure. But so they can't pop up to get their refueling done. So we had to go to them. We did low-level air refueling. That necessitated essentially a safety observer. So when the C-17 guys, and their mission is called SOAR II, Special Operations Low Level. Don't ask me what the 2 stands for. So we were the counterpart to that for them, and then for everything the MC-130s do, right? Because I don't think they ever fly above like 5,000 feet. So we were their counterpart to that. They're coming in and out of the target, and they can't pop up. So it was our job just to connect with them on their low-level route, basically. And they would marginally increase in altitude. And the C-17s, when they do SOAR II, they add an extra pilot, and he sits in the back with a chart and a laptop and a GPS puck that creates a moving map display. And they're just there as an extra set of eyes, safety observer, calling out threats, terrain threats primarily. And I don't know much more about the C-17 side of that, but the KC-135 already had navigators. They went away in the late 90s, early 2000s. And instead of trying to put another pilot on board, they just kept a contingent of navs to do that. So there was still a navigator suite there. A lot of it had been hollowed out. We lost our terrain following radar. Unfortunately, that went away with the Cold War when they didn't expect a nuclear war to break out and tankers to have to navigate via radar only, right? So they just kept us on, and we sat there. It's the same thing that the SOAR II pilots did, is we sat there with a laptop and a moving map. We had access to the FMS. We had the flight management system. We had the horizontal situation indicator with the compass and all that, altimeter, and just folded into the crew that way to make sure that they didn't smack into something on the ground.
We fly out of South Whiting Field in a helicopter. So for me, the 57, soon to be the 73, the Thrasher, really cool new machine. But we go east, we do our low-level routes, and I'm going to make up numbers, 300, 500, whatever, and we won't tag the MC-130 in this story with an altitude. I'll just say this, seeing an MC-130 co-altitude or lower than you out to the east of Whiting when we're doing our stuff, it's a big airplane.
Yeah.
And it's pretty impressive. And that was in the daytime, and I've seen them flying at night too. Well, I haven't seen them. I'm aware that they're out there flying at night.
Oh, yeah.
And again, at very low altitude. So this is not up in the bososphere type stuff. This is at low altitude.
Yeah. And like I said, they would pop up to come get gas marginally. And the low-level altitude for the SOAR mission and the tanker is also classified. But I will say that it is higher than the C-130s go and lower than you'd want to fly a 4-engine Boeing 707 type airplane.
What's the spool-up process making you, I'm going to say combat-coded, combat-ready is probably the better term. What's that like when you get to McConnell?
At McConnell, you go right into your ops squadron. The FTU, or the formal training unit, which is, I believe you guys call it, is it the Fleet Replacement Squadron?
FRS, absolutely. Yep,
okay.
FRS. Used to be a RAG, Replacement Air Group, for the old guys listening.
Yeah, and I was going to say RAG because it sounds so much cooler.
It does, and we can call it a RAG. I don't know who gets offended by saying RAG, but yeah. RAG, FRS, either way.
So the FTU is our equivalent, and it's there. It's just across the street from the squadrons. So we would sit in our ops squadron until we were ready to class up in the FTU. Then you go to the FTU, and it's probably a 6-month process. There's a basic qual, and then there's the SOAR mission qual. And then the pilots have to qualify for SOAR as well, so there were specific ones. And then one unique thing that we had that was part of the SOAR mission that was only included in the tankers at McConnell was we had what we called the KC-135 RT, which was the receiver tankers. So when and this is one of my favorite bit of history about the KC-135 is that when the SR-71 was a thing, I'm sure we've all seen, all the aviation nerds have seen that the fuel tanks would leak on the ground until they sealed because of the temperature of the air friction. So when it took off, it basically immediately needed gas. The problem was that it burned a different kind of gas. So they took these tankers. Some of them were former RC-135s that had built-in air refueling systems, and some of them were modified by a company called LTV. So it's one of those classic military things where you have 2 airframes doing the same thing with 2 different systems that you have to learn, and you could step to either one of them. You don't know which one it's going to be. But they could segregate their center fuel tanks, and they could burn only out of the wing tanks, and they could put this special, and I'm trying to remember, it was probably like JP8, almost gelatinous fuel or something like that they could put in the body tanks to give to this SR-71 because it immediately needed gas as soon as it got up to 20,000 feet. But the tanker couldn't burn it, so they could segregate their tanks, fill it up with that, burn out of the wing tanks. The problem then being that the tanker is also a gas hog, and burning out of the wing tanks only wasn't always enough to be able to go from where they were to refuel and back. So they made them refuelable. Another KC-135 could come and give gas to this. So this created an opportunity for the SOAR guys to get a hold of them. That's what they did. They took all of them, and they had the only KC-135s in the fleet that had receiver qualified pilots. So a lot of SOAR pilots would also get their receiver qual. The navs had to be receiver qualled as just a matter of course.
I don't think anyone joins the military without knowing that they're going to deploy.
Right.
Sometimes inside the United States, mostly outside the United States. Where were some of those deployments? Where'd you go? And I'm sure there's some fun flying stories associated with them.
I deployed 8 times with the tanker and then 2 more in the new plane since. With the tanker, we always went to Al Udeid. So that's where we were permanently deployed to, essentially. The rotation was really rough at McConnell. For the navigators especially, there just weren't enough to meet the need. And, we spoke AFSOC. We had some SOCOM communications gear on board the specific SOAR birds. We went downrange for the purpose of serving SOCCENT. So we belonged to Combined Joint Special Operations Command Afghanistan, really just CENTCOM in general once that kicked off too, once Iraq came back. So we would fly in support of the gunships primarily. So it's funny, our primary mission at home, like the SOAR mission, was designed for MC-130s and C-17s, and then when we went downrange, almost all we ever saw were gunships, AC-130s all day, every day. So that was primarily what we were doing. We would fly into Afghanistan via the Gulf and then up Pakistan and into Afghanistan, always at night. I think we called it day SOAR, and it was a nightmare. The gunships hated it when they got tasked to fly during the day because I'm sure you're aware of the history. Gunships during the day are they're a juicy target, and they're fat and slow. So we would have we actually had a liaison officer embedded with CJSOAC at Bagram who would sit there and coordinate all of their tanking activities, and we didn't belong to the typical ATO cycle like the rest of the tanker guys did. All we did was work for the special operations guys. Just a nightly grind for us, but our cycle was probably the worst deployment cycle I've ever worked under because we were gone for 70 days and home for 70 days. I did that for 5 years. I got a short break in there to do my instructor upgrade.
That's going to grind you to the ground.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They shut down the nav program since a couple of years after I left there. But yeah, I don't know many of those guys that stuck around for very long. When I left, as I said, there were 54 when I got there. There were 26 when I left.
Wow. We talk about a demand signal, right? Like there's a definite need
Sure.
for those folks that are doing that mission. But by the same token, if you don't take care of them, like you can light yourself on fire at a certain point to try to keep somebody else warm. But
yeah. And
then you're on fire.
Yeah, right. and when I was there was always talk about shutting down the nav program, which they finally did do. But I felt like every 6 months we would have this discussion about, well, what do we do about it? And it kind of got to the point where like the jets got some upgrades in the avionics and stuff like that. And I think a lot of us shared the notion that we were kind of becoming obsolete. And if you've ever worked in a job where you're not necessarily needed anymore, I'm trying to be polite about how I say that, but it's not really fulfilling. And that's why I kind of sought employment elsewhere. So on top of that, you don't have this particularly fulfilling job, and then you get hammered with these deployment after deployment after deployment. But it was still neat for us, more in tune with, I think, the combat mindset than your average tanker crew. One of the coolest things that we did was early on, and they shut it down, but Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan became an alert base for us. Right around 2014, 2015, there was a lot of troops in contact situations, and they were running into this situation where the tankers didn't have enough gas to stay through the entire night if a situation's evolved. So they elected instead to put an alert crew at Mazar-e-Sharif, and we would sleep in a tent on the flight line, like an Alaskan tent, the big round top tents, and we would do what we call cocking on the jet, which is something we actually take from the nuclear enterprise, where it's everything on the jet is waiting for you to turn the engines on. So when the navigator runs, he's the first one up the crew entry chute. When he runs up the crew entry chute, there's a switch on the underside of the door. It starts the APUs. You just hit the button. APUs are running by the time everyone's inside. Once you get inside, the co-pilot and the pilot simultaneously start engines, which are all ready to go. You just turn on the master power switch, and then you crank engine 1 and 3 at the same time and 2 and 4 at the same time. And then you can have a jet airborne within like 10 minutes.
And I'm guessing that's a holdover again from the Cold War where we had to get these aircraft airborne quickly. And
that's a thing that we still train to. So that still goes on. You'll see if you ever hear the phrase NORI, an ORI is an operational readiness inspection. The N is nuclear, so nuclear operational readiness inspection. They still do them. It's still a qual that's maintained, which was another great insight that I got while in the tanker, like getting to look at that infrastructure, like how we're going to go to war in the event that happens. And it was fascinating. And once a year, you have to requalify on it.
Tremendous amount of work, I'm told. A lot of knowledge.
Yes. Yeah. And you can fail. It is not a gentleman's course. You could definitely get decertified, and then that would be a discussion with the wing commander. They took it very seriously.
Yeah, as they should, right? Anything with that level of gravity.
Sure. Yeah, that's a no-fail, right?
Yeah.
As they say. But yeah, so we sat on the ramp there, and one of the coolest things they ever did was they literally had a klaxon. The klaxon went off. They would say troops in contact. They'd hand you your airspace on a card on the way out the door, and you'd sprint to the jet, turn it on, get airborne, and there was a thirsty gunship waiting for you. And the goal was minimize their time off station. The Taliban knew the sound of a gunship. And they knew that the minute that they couldn't hear that drone anymore, that droning noise of the engine, that was their chance. And so they would take advantage of that. Our goal of the crews that I flew with was to have them on and off the boom so that their time off target was 20 minutes or less. Turns out that the low-level mission became kind of important. One, because gunships don't climb that well, especially when they have an entire rack of 105 shells in there, and it's hot in Afghanistan, and the density altitude's super high because you're already super high in the mountains. So like our low-level experience actually came in handy doing that. It made sure that they were able to come up and meet us.
Any good stories from that mission set, being on alert, and just things that stick out to you as I've never been on alert. That's not the way that I operated the fleet aircraft that I flew, but I've heard a lot of good stories of, like you said, on-call. You're not on-call CAS, but can't happen without you.
Most of the alert stuff ended up being pretty benign, but we did have one. It was kind of like what the fighters call yo-yo ops. So we would offload, go up and onload, go back down and offload, and we would just do that. My longest sortie was a 13.1 in the tanker. That was this night. It was particularly heavy fire on the ground. The LNO actually gave us the admonition that we stay off of it. Verbally, he gave us the frequency for the JTAC. And so we listened to the JTAC do call for fires all night. And the gunship came up to us at one point. I think it was their first tank. And you could hear it in the guy's voice. It wasn't panic, right? It was like this pleading urgency to please, dear God, be a good tanker crew tonight. They came up on the boom and they could not keep up with us. They kept falling off. And we do what's called a toboggan, where we do about a 500 foot per minute descent. And that allows them to push up the props. And he's like, hey guys, I'm torching my engines. So we started the descent and it still wasn't helping. And he's like, can you give us any lower? And my pilot, she just turned around and looked at me, like made sure she made eye contact. And she said, can you get us clean air? And I just asked her, I was like, do you trust me? She said she did. I said, all right, I think you should descend at 750 feet per minute, and I think we should head down this valley. Now, like I said, I can't tell you what the altitude limit is, but we were below it, like well below it. I was really proud of my community that night because it was, I think that's kind of rare in tankers, especially after you've been in Afghanistan for 15 years, and frankly, people lost their intensity. And so here we were bending some rules, breaking some rules, so that we could make sure that the on-call CAS happened, right? So we ended up flying down a valley with mountain peaks above us. And I was talking to the airspace controller, the military airspace controller. They were very like, stay in your airspace. Like, this is your box. We already built it for you 6 years ago. Use it. I was like, unable. All grids in the military grid reference system are broken up into, 1,000 meter by 1,000 meter or 1 nautical mile by 1 nautical mile. And they're all coded. So it's usually a 3-digit and 2 letters. I'm just going to make one up, like 489 Bravo Charlie. So you got 489 Bravo Charlie. And if you move to the east on the map, you get 490 Bravo Charlie. And if you go down on the map, you get 489 Bravo Delta. It's just these numbers that you just have to spit out. And so what I'm doing is I'm getting the kill box that I'm in or the keypad that I'm in and the one in front of us as airspace, and they're granting me the clearance. And then I'm asking them to close the one behind me and open the one to the left of me, and then we turn left. And then we get into that one. And I'm just on one radio talking to the receiver. On the other one, I'm talking to the controller. And I've got my chart and my moving map elevation display. And I'm just trying to make us not hit a mountain. So we did that and came back up after they got their gas and listened to them continue the fight. We went and hit a tanker for ourselves and then went and did it 2 or 3 more times that night. And then came home and just, I think I slept for 2 days after that.
I'm going to tell a very benign story compared to that. But on the Navy side, one of the things I was taught very early on by a mentor, I wish I could remember, I won't dime him out either way. Is it legal? Is it safe? The 2-part test, right? And so let's be clear. We always want to be legal. We always want to be safe.
Sure.
But if I have to sacrifice one of those, I will raise my hand and say, I have violated NATOPS. I have violated CNAF. I'm sure I've violated other things that I'm not, I'm always aware of them. But the reason I mention that, a very, again, benign example would be for us on the Navy side, you can't dump gas below 3,000 feet AGL. In the Gulf, flying the helicopter that I flew, we're at 500 feet AGL. There were times we would dump gas below 3K, and I'm violating NATOPS when I do that.
Yep.
And we had all these mitigations in place. We talked about it as adults. We talked about it afterwards, right? We didn't hide this. It's not something that we're, afraid of. But the point is, the mission had to be accomplished a certain way. And so, yes, absolutely, you are breaking a rule. But at the end of the day, what are you there to do? You're there to support that asset.
Yeah.
You know that you're safe. At no point do you want to fly into a mountain or take them into a mountain with you, right? You're backing up from, this is the mission I have to accomplish safely. How am I going to do it? And you did. That's incredible.
It was, for me, the calculus in my mind is that if somebody calls me on this, if somebody even finds out and calls me on this, can I stand up and confidently make my case and hope that they accept it, but with the knowledge that if they don't, I would much rather hand him my wings than have to watch another casket ceremony. I think that's what all of us in the air are or should be concerned about. Are we doing our job well enough that it gives an American on the ground the absolute best chance of staying alive? When you're on that frequency too, I think the LNO knew. I think that he gave us that frequency so that we would get it. And it worked really well. Not one of us had a moment's hesitation about, well, the rules say. It was a no-brainer for us.
A lot of times I'll ask folks, especially folks that fly in crewed aircraft, when you're a pilot, I'll say, who's the favorite backseater you flew with? And generally I want to know because there's a CRM story. There's usually kind of that bond, that trust. But this is the first time I've had the chance to ask the question the other way around. Are there any pilots, any folks that you've flown with that you said, man, that's who I want to become? That's not, I say become, not as a pilot, as an officer, as an aviator. That's the kind of leadership that I want to exude one day when I'm in that position to do it.
She was a weapons officer, your version of the Top Gun school, right? The tankers do have a weapons school, and she was a graduate and an instructor there, and she's since left the military. But I flew 3 deployments with her, 3 of my 7 with her. By choice, always volunteered to go with her if I could. Huge mentor to me. Took me seriously too in a community where that's not always the norm. Sometimes you were self-loading baggage, and she was definitely very engaging with the entire crew, brought the entire crew into the process, including the navigators, which was a big deal to me. When I flew with her, I never felt unnecessary.
You made that comment about self-loading baggage, and sometimes our backseater students at 10 will make that joke. And I'm like, no, only if you choose to be. If you choose to be, absolutely, you can just be someone that's along for the ride.
Yeah.
And if you choose to be an active participant in your destiny and you bring value to others, guess what? People will want to fly with you. They have to fly with you anyway, but they will want to fly with you, and that's how you bring value to everyone.
I hear self-loading baggage sometimes in my community, and I'd like to think I have a pretty decent sense of humor, but not for that. I have no tolerance for that whatsoever. When I hear one of my young CISOs say that, I will usually pull them aside and be like, I know you meant it as a joke, but it's really not. Your goal as a CISO in a room full of pilots who think that they can do this by themselves, you should be the guy that turns the cockiest of them into the guy that says, I want to fly with him over there.
Everyone's experience is different. I don't think you do that by being an aggressive dick. A lot of times you do it by, you know what, I'm just going to sit back here and let you figure it out by yourself. Oh, you can't. Congratulations. I'm here to help.
Yeah.
And I'm bringing a little bit of sarcasm into that.
Oh, yeah.
You bring value, and then they realize, holy crap, I really do need that Ryan guy. He does know what's going on.
And I've always said, be value added. I tease our co-pilots sometimes, usually about pilot stuff, just because I know it gets under their skin a little and it makes me laugh. Like, hey, I fly a tail dragger on the civilian side, so I'm always like, hey, you want to step on the rudder a little there? So sometimes I'll make the joke, and I don't really mean it, but it's not about walking out to the airplane thing I'm going to catch and penalize the front seaters today for every mistake that they make. That's not the way to go about it.
And some of the best aviators I've known, you can tell they care, but they don't have to say it. You can tell that they care about you as a person, your professional development. And let's be real, everyone that we fly with, this is going to sound really weird, so from a Navy guy especially, buckle up. Everyone we fly with, we touch in one way or another, right? You leave an imprint on that person, hopefully for the better, right? Maybe you leave them with a tip, a trick, some kind of information that's going to maybe save their life one day, or maybe even better yet, save the life of someone they pass that on to as well.
Right.
And if you approach it with that attitude, not this adversarial, and let's be clear, I think in the military we can all be adversarial and hostile.
Yeah.
Given no enemy to fight, we'll fight one another if that's what it takes. But even that being said, right, if you take it from that attitude of, I've got all the sayings, right? A rising tide lifts all boats, all that stuff, right? And we're all on the same team, going after the same mission. Things are going to happen in the right way. But if you're not, we can have this big downhill spiral and everyone's going to be miserable together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go the other direction instead of being miserable. Any other good stories from Afghanistan? I've never been to that part of the world. I'm told in some parts it's incredibly beautiful, in some parts it's very much not. But I know nothing about it other than what I've seen in books and movies and TV, and unfortunately on TV in 2021. But any thoughts on Afghanistan?
You nailed it. The western part of the country is a big desert. The eastern part of the country would make people that live in Aspen and Vail jealous. I always described it as hauntingly beautiful because it was just these pristine snow-capped mountains, and there was so much awfulness on the ground down there that you couldn't see from the air, but you knew it was there. It was heartbreaking sometimes. That part of the world, you could literally see places where the common joke was just to be flying along and point out, I'm going to put my resort there when this country turns around. I don't know that that'll ever happen, but it is really pretty at times. I did the liaison officer gig at one point. It was my 3rd deployment, and I was in Bagram. And man, I don't know that I've ever loved going for a run anywhere more than Bagram, Afghanistan. You're in a bowl surrounded by mountains on all sides. In the winter, it's indistinguishable from the Rockies, except for, the rockets and stuff like that.
Not a lot of mortars in Colorado, hopefully.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. What did you think of the base itself? Obviously a huge presence, no longer, of course, but...
Bagram was interesting because it got so big, and we were huddled off in a little corner of it where the SOCOM element was. And so we had kind of our own little world there that was kind of like untouched by like big blue Air Force or big green Army or anything like that. So like the rules were a little different. And so people didn't like us and thought we were cowboys. And not me, but some guys had beards. And, you know, the minute that I knew I was in a SOCOM environment, I was walking back from the gym, and Rangers had just come in from one of their advise assist village clearing operations or something like that. And I guess they were going house to house, and some guy came at this kid in just the wrong way. And somebody clapped him on the back and said, "Hey, man, you got to use your hatchet for the first time tonight." And they were talking about celebrating, probably the wrong word, but commending him for his first hatchet kill, I guess. I was like, wow, there's a war out there for real.
Yeah, if you're not connected to it, it's very easy to be disconnected from it. Again, I lived in Bahrain for 3 deployments for 6 months in the capital, in a beautiful city, wonderful amenities. We were very well taken care of, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my God, my helicopter didn't have air conditioning. Oh,
right.
No, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but like, if you're anything like me, you went into Bahrain City, or is that what it is? Bahrain City?
Manama is the capital.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we would go into Doha from Al Udeid all the time.
I didn't know that was that's a whole different conversation. Maybe we can or can't talk about it. I didn't realize that there was any cross-pollination. We would fly, and you mentioned Al Udeid. We would fly to Al Udeid for our FAM flights. About an hour to get there, about an hour bounces on the pad, and then an hour back. And if we do the arithmetic, I think probably you left before I finally got there. But since a very young age, I knew I wanted to be in the military. 9/11 was obviously a big part of that as well. But always wanted to go to the Middle East because that just seemed like it made sense. And then getting over there, I was not in a combat role. I was not even close to a combat role.
Right.
And so then it doesn't seem real until some of my friends, I rotate home. A couple months later, a big individual is killed over in Iraq, Soleimani. And then all of a sudden, my friends on deck that were otherwise, doing very basic flights to Al Udeid or doing very important flights to other places in the helicopters that I just got done flying. So there's a very, I hate the term FOMO, but I guess I'll say it. There's a very big feeling of you got to be part of something real and very important. And I hope you realize that and respect that, because there are plenty of us that haven't been. Hopefully one day for me it will happen. But that's incredible that you knew if y'all weren't there in some of these cases, bad things would happen, like you said, to Americans on the ground.
Sure.
Hopefully an incredible feeling, hopefully something you can appreciate, because I certainly appreciate the heck out of it.
Yeah, we wandered from your original question was just about...
We'll get back to it, yeah.
What Afghanistan looked like. I just wanted to make sure that I threw this bit in, probably just out of sheer arrogance. That morning after that 13-hour sortie, we're cruising back. We had that block of airspace carved out of Pakistan that we were allowed to transit. That's how we got home. So as we're flying over or in the vicinity of Karachi, the sun comes up and hits the snow-capped mountains out there in Karachi, Pakistan. They're starting to calm down a little bit there. They're not quite as intense as the rest of the Hindu Kush. But my co-pilot goes, another Karachi sunrise, because it was probably like the third night in a row that we had been up past sunrise in Afghanistan. I jokingly said, hey, there's a song in that somewhere. And after I'd left the tanker and I was living in Clovis, New Mexico, I got a call one day from a friend of my father's who runs a nonprofit out of Nashville called Operation Song. They pair songwriters with veterans to help them process their time at combat. I think they needed some lighter material for promotional work, because it can get pretty heavy when you're talking about guys who've been on the ground. They were like, Steve's kid's an aviator, and we can talk to him. Dual benefit, he's also a musician. So they wanted to kind of use me for some promo stuff. And this songwriter from Nashville sat down just like we did now. His name was Chuck Jones, by the way. He's a fantastic musician, a great guy. And he pulled that story out of me. And he's like, well, that's obviously the song. So 3 or 4 years hence from the night that we had another Karachi sunrise, we wrote the song Karachi Sunrise. He recorded it and we collaborated on it. And I think you can get it on their website now.
What a way to remember that, because talk about the reason they did the podcast is photos, video, it only captures so much.
Right.
If you weren't there to experience that and have that story, no one else would ever know. That's not something anyone, again, back home would ever get to be a part of. And then for people that ask me, I love doing this at air shows, especially ask about joining the military and all. A lot of people have some very, very good questions. You'll never get put in these places. You'll never get to be a part of some of this crazy cool stuff if you're not part of the team and doing stuff like that. And it's hard to quantify. It's hard to explain, because you might tell a story like that and someone's like, oh, wow, the sun rose over Pakistan. But I'm sure to you will literally never forget that. And there's a song to memorialize it, even better.
Oh, yeah. It was a cool experience for sure.
Okay, earlier, I guess off the air, as we'll say, we talked about what's the right way to say this? Working with other services. So you mentioned the Army a moment ago. I don't know, any good stories working with, I'm guessing, other special operations entities, be it Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, I was about to say Coast Guard. I don't think there's any special operations you worked with there, but any good stories working with our partners in other services?
In the tanker, we were pretty far removed from a lot of that stuff, which is why I volunteered to do the liaison thing. I still am kind of surprised by it to this day, but we had a seat in the Joint Operations Center for a siege of SOAC. So I sat between, honestly, kind of to give you an idea of how important tankers are, I sat between the fires desk and the mobility desk. So MC-130s to my right and gunships and all that other stuff to my left. Behind me was Night Stalker Row, as we called it. So Intel and Flight Director for Night Stalkers. And man, I cannot say enough good things about Night Stalkers. Down to their Intel people and just incredibly professional for one, obviously, but just like the knowledge and capability that they had. Their aviators, their blood must be ice cold at all times. And you as a helicopter guy have got to know that some of the stuff that they do is just insane. Watching little birds climb buildings before they land on top of it. So in the tanker, my experience now, since my joint experience we can talk about is way more prolific than that. But aside from just meeting them and working beside them in the jock for that one 90-day stint, I didn't get a lot of joint stuff out of it. I'd go on what I call a fun run sometime. You don't need a navigator to do a fighter drag or something like that. But if you're going to drag the Thunderbirds or something like that, you'll usually find a navigator somewhere on the tanker. But I like to go up when we did the drogue missions. The way a tanker works for the Air Force, we have a boom that sticks out the back of the airplane. It plugs into the receptacle of another aircraft, right? That's just an Air Force thing. The Navy has probes on the airplanes, and we have to put out a drogue, which I think the Navy calls it a basket, and it's a hose with a net on it. It looks like a shuttlecock, and you just plug the probe into it, right? So we had birds called MIPers, multi-point refueling system, and had pods on each wing. And so we could let those out. We could let the hoses out of the pods. They would drag behind the airplane. You could do Navy guys that way. And then that retained the capability of the boom. But we also had what we called the boom drogue assembly. And man, I'll tell you what, for having a job as phallic as we did, this just was the icing on the cake. It was a section of, hard to estimate from the ground, but say maybe 7 to 10 feet of hose that would literally strap on to the boom at the end, and it would dangle off the back, and then you had the basket on the end of it, and the basket was lined in like hard aluminum on the outside, so it wasn't the soft drogues that you usually get. It was like this very heavy, very hard shuttlecock kind of thing. And I can't say we did it because I guess I don't know whose fault it is, but the best joint experience I ever had was when the Navy would either rip one off of the MIPers baskets, or when we would rip the probe off of like an F-18 and then have to send it to them. And when it gets shipped out, there's always a copious amount of alcohol that goes with that when you return it as an apology. So my joint experience with the Navy was very positive. I was usually drinking with them.
I love it. That sounds about right. Anytime, I'm guessing it's usually the receiving aircraft. So I have all of, just for clarity, behind a KC-130, Marine Bird, all of 3 plugs in a 53. And it was awesome and terrifying all at the same time. For us, the probe extends, again, talking about the phallic references. I'll just say 6 to 9 feet because I can't remember the exact number, but the probe extends a decent ways. But the thing is, right, your tip path plane, your rotor system is still there, like on the way we'd always remember it. In your right hand, you're going to have the cyclic, which is fore aft, left and right, the stick, as you would think.
Right.
Left hand, you're going to have the collective. So, pull up, you go up, push down, you go down, just keeping it real broad. But the cyclic, the one in your right hand, every inch of movement fore and aft, the blades would move a foot up and down.
Holy cow.
Yeah, so you can cut your own probe off is kind of the reason I mentioned that. And I was very fortunate. He's XO at one of the squadrons now. I won't name him, but really, really great individual. He let me fly with a GoPro on that flight. So I have video of my 3 plugs, which for a number of reasons is super, super cool. But you can see very small flight control movements, and you look up and you can see the tip path plane dancing. And we're at 110 knots, whatever it is, right? So you can hurt yourself. You can hurt the tanker. You can hurt a lot of things. Just tanking, which you say just tanking, it's still critical, but it's not. We're not dropping hate on bad guys. Maybe not admin, but it's one of the basic tasks, but good Lord, you can't do the other stuff without that. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's my experience from the other side of the basket. Anything else before we get out of the 135? I think we had maybe one more story before you transition in your career you wanted to tell.
First, I'll just say that I really like the tanker as an airplane. The newest one I ever flew was from 1962. The oldest was from 1957. By the way, I want to add a point of contention here about all of the buff guys, the B-52 guys who say they fly the oldest plane in the inventory. They fly the oldest design in the inventory. But all of the B-52s currently flying are younger than the oldest tanker currently flying. So I just want to say 1957 is the oldest airplane in the Air Force right now.
We got it on the record. I love it.
But yeah, it's an Art Deco dream of an airplane, cruises at 0.9 Mach. It can cruise at 0.9 Mach. It was a great plane, 88,000 pounds of thrust. I was really proud to be a part of that it's a flying piece of history. And I don't mean that in the derogatory way that some people use it. They were great airplanes. I've shut down every engine on the tanker too, one at a time. Different incidents are...
Okay, you can't get away without telling at least one of those stories.
They were all benign. So one, we had a drive generator that failed to disengage at one point, so that you got to shut the engine down, right? Some of them were over temps or something like that. I had an oil transducer explode on one. Our oil pressure was bouncing up against the bottom of the range on the gauge. The pilots were looking at it, and it's you got to get a warning light and a low pressure on the gauge in order for it to be a mandatory shutdown. And they were kind of praying to the gauge, like, come on, buddy, come on, because it's flickering. You know, it could be a gauge error. We're over the Rocky Mountains, you know, which it's a 4-engine airplane. It's not a big deal.
The dreaded 3-engine approach.
Yeah. But eventually the light comes on and the pilot's like, oh. So yeah, we shut it down. And when we got out of the plane, we landed at emergency landing at Spokane, Washington. Fairchild.
Yep.
Yes, we landed, which is a tanker base. So we flew from Denver to Fairchild on 3 engines because we had maintenance there, which is not normally something you would do if you had lost an engine. But when we got out of the jet, maintenance cracked open the cowling on the number 3 engine and oil fell out. Like all of the oil left in the engine, which was only a couple of quarts, which means like I think 20 quarts of oil had been lost somewhere over the Rocky Mountains. And that was just when they cracked it. When they opened it, parts fell out. So parts of the oil system just started falling out. That was the only engine that had to be canned. The rest of them we were able to nurse back to health after landing.
You mentioned, the 135. It's going to go away one day, eventually, right? KC-46 is, I think, what's replacing the KC-10 on the, and again, I'm ignorant on the Air Force stuff, I shouldn't be. I believe KC-10s are going to be retired first. 135s will fly into the sunset at some point as 46s come online, but there's a lot of 135s out there.
There are.
46s are not coming off the line as fast as 135s need to be replaced. So this airplane still has a lot of life left in it.
Going back to how the B-52 measures their longevity, it'll rival the B-52. They keep upgrading the cockpit, so I've got to imagine that they've got plans for it for a while.
For sure. While we're talking about it, just because I'm stream of conscious here, bouncing back and forth, you talked about how many years at McConnell? 5 years?
5 years.
5 years. How many deployments?
7, 8, including the LNO deployment.
Okay. And it's interesting. So the LNO was just to be an LNO. There's no flying associated with that.
No,
okay.
I was at Bagram for that.
The reason I mentioned that is there's a lot of deploying. We talk about burnout and taking care of our people and all that stuff as well. Looking back on it, is there something that if someone had given you this advice of, again, looking at it with the benefit of time, what could you have done better to maybe take care of yourself or maybe the folks around you? Because again, burnout is very, very real. Any advice or any suggestions for those that are maybe staring down the face of beginning that train as opposed to looking back at it in the rearview mirror?
Yeah, if it's all right with you, I'm going to tell a pretty personal story about that. So to kind of recap where I'm at, I've come out of the academy, wash out of pilot training. I get what I naively and incorrectly considered kind of a bum assignment out of CISO training. I show up at McConnell. There's some burnout there, and you know what that does to the attitude of the people around you, and that attitude is infectious. During that time, I had gotten married, so I drop into this lifestyle that is not what I planned and not what I wanted. It's I wouldn't say the community was toxic. It was tough. And we've got this one-to-one deployment cycle and you're burning out. And so I come home from Afghanistan from the Bagram deployment, actually. My wife, who was active duty as well, she was deployed to Turkey. So I came home to an empty house. She deployed after I did, but while I was gone, she wasn't coming back for another 6 months or so. We developed some problems while I was gone. Stuff that had been simmering. I'm sure that at the time I wasn't the most pleasant person to live with. I had my moments. And then I think we got married young and kind of fast. And where I'm going with that is that while she's there and we're trying to work things out, it fell apart. And she asked for a divorce, basically via text message, more or less. There's some stuff on top of that. I was a tanker toad, as we call it, take off and die, which was the nuclear nickname for the tanker mission. So I was a tanker guy. I was not expecting to see some of the things I saw when I was at Bagram. And given what I do now, not all that shocking. If you walk into it unprepared, it can be. Honestly, I'd rather do what I do now than sit in a jock for 18 hours a day and watch Kill TV. I don't think that's good for the human psyche. At least it's not for mine. So all of that leads to I'm wallowing. I was just in the worst possible headspace and just kind of turned inward into like this very dark mindset. And I kind of was like, life is garbage. I was never suicidal or anything like that, but I was just like, screw everything. Like, who cares about anything? Nothing matters. Just this like complete, I think, a pathetic mindset. And I was just like, I think you're always seeking happiness, right? And I mistook seeking commiseration or something with happiness. I just wanted to get mine because I felt like life was super cruel, right? It's like, just take what you can, right? I had become friends with this couple who was an Air Force officer and his wife, and he deployed. She showed kindness to me in a time when I was struggling, right? I think she thought that I was going to go somewhere dark and she kind of wanted to save me. And, pretty ashamed to admit it, but she and I started a relationship together. We had an affair. And my thought at the time was this totally postmodernist, nihilistic point of view. I was just like, I don't care what I'm doing. Life sucks. Who cares? Have fun while you can. And so he found out about it, and being an Air Force officer and you being a naval officer, I'm sure you're familiar with Article 134. So he told his chain of command. It came down my chain of command. And I received a letter of reprimand for adultery, which I'm pretty sure I'm the first person that law's been used on in like 50 years. That's a kiss of death for an officer. So coming out the other side of that, I kind of woke up one day and looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself, like just morally. I just had no idea who I was. I felt totally rudderless. I knew that internally I hated what I had become so much more than what I thought was this cruel life. And I just kind of started searching. And I came across a Navy guy, Admiral James Stockdale, who had been shot down over Vietnam, was a POW for a time at the Hanoi Hilton. And while I imagine it wasn't when he was there, it must have been beforehand, he had studied the classics. He became a proponent of, or a practitioner of, Stoic philosophy. And one of the things Stoicism teaches you is that you're not in control of a whole lot of things. And you're only in control of how you respond to it, how you react to it, what you do with it. Life can attempt to grind you down. It's up to you whether or not you let it. I started picking up this book. It's either Reflections of or Thoughts of a Philosophical Fighter Pilot. And I was just like, well, okay, universe. Well played. This would get my attention. But he talks about maintaining control in the worst of situations is all about controlling how you react to stuff, that you can't let your emotions rule you. I thought I had like this super cool hipstery nihilism thing going on. Like really what it was is it was just an excuse for me to just like rule myself by emotion and just to let all of the worst parts of me take over. Looking back at it's a super long answer to your question, but looking back at my time there in that community, I wish I had found Stoicism so much sooner than I did. That would be my one advice to young me. Go back and take myself by the shoulders and shake myself and just say, you are in control of your own self. Life is going to throw you curveballs all the time. You have to do something to make it meaningful or to shake it off or to redirect yourself or put your energy elsewhere kind of thing. I ruined my career because of it. Obviously I'm still in, but I'm unpromotable and I've been in for 12 years. I'm still in 03. I'll probably retire as an 03. And that's how I deal with that now. Is that, look, I can't make the Air Force think I'm worthy of a promotion, but what I can do is be a damn good captain. That's what I would walk away from that whole thing with.
Some people talk about, when they'll talk about a traumatic experience or something bad that happens in their life, and they'll look at it in retrospect and say, it's the best thing that ever happened to me because of what they learned from it, what they took away from it. Is that something you feel? And I'm, again, getting you totally off guard here, but I'm just kind of curious as I hear you speak, because I can tell you've learned from it. I can tell you become a better person from it. But by the same token, everyone experiences these things differently. So I'm kind of curious, did you have that experience with it?
I will not say it's the best thing that ever happened to me.
It's totally fair.
I've always found that kind of...
very trite, I would say.
Well, I look at it and I'm like, that is rationalization to a level that is maybe I'm not comfortable with. The catch here is that the woman in question is my wife now. That sucks a little bit more because I can't even tell people usually how I met her. But of course, now it's on the internet, so...
Not yet, but yes. Fair enough.
So there was good that came out of it. It redirected me. I found her because of it, right? And there's more to her side of the story. Her marriage wasn't perfect. And so there was some stuff on her end as well, But I don't like to think of it as the best thing that ever happened to me. I like to think of it as the best reaction to something that I've ever had.
And that's a really good way to say that because, we're not responsible for what happens to us. This is maybe another way to kind of dumb down stoicism for someone like me. We're not responsible for what happens to us. We're responsible for how we handle it. I know we talked about that a little bit before we started recording, but it is so powerful because I think sometimes in life, and this is me pontificating about society in general, there's not a lot of guardrails, or at least it doesn't seem there are for people. And so people can end up making very, 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 very bad decisions. And I'm talking about, let's say someone that's never been taught how to drive a car and they somehow they got their learner's permit. Now they're behind the wheel of a 3,000-pound bullet, essentially.
Yeah, how about these guys who haven't soloed yet, taking passengers up in their airplanes? I feel like that makes the news fairly regularly.
And that is terrifying.
In the aviation world.
Yeah. But because they've never been held accountable. Maybe they didn't have a trusted mentor that would tell them, hey, dude, don't do that, please. Yeah. Or they've never been caught, right? They're going out there, and then now when they make a mistake, they're going to have really, really terrible repercussions. Let's say, God forbid, they're involved in an accident or an incident. They kill someone or hurt someone. There have been a couple times in my Navy career, and I'll keep it real broad, where very, very few, thankfully, but I've had to be the person to kind of raise my hand and say, hey, this needs to be fixed. And it's very uncomfortable. And when I look back at them, the only thing that I have regret is that I didn't speak sooner. And again, I'm not talking about your situation, talking about two entirely different things here, but...
That's valid even for my situation, is that, just to clarify, I'm 100% responsible for what I did here, but man, wouldn't it have been nice if somebody had been like, hey dude, you don't look right. Something about you is different and you're acting a fool.
And so be that person for someone else. If
absolutely.
you see someone in your life, it is uncomfortable.
Yes.
It is challenging. And it makes a difference if you do it right. And you know what? If you mess it up, they were going to do whatever they were, potentially was going to happen anyway, but at least you can have that clean conscience.
That's the lesson I try to pass on to people, is that, like, especially in this line of work, tragedy or trauma and failure are going to be things that you have to deal with. And mark the date, I was 27 years old when I learned how to deal with both of them at the same time. And that's way too late.
And I hope folks that's first off an incredible story, and I appreciate you
Sure.
being forthright and sharing it. Try to find people around you can trust. And for some people, it's mom and dad. For some people, it's maybe a grandparent. For others, sometimes getting outside the family, maybe there's actually an added benefit, a trusted mentor that maybe you don't feel that judgment from. You can tell them things that, I don't know, maybe you don't want to tell mom or dad, for example.
Right.
But if you don't have that network of folks around you, I have folks internationally that I reach out to that are friends. I have folks in other services, for example, or that fly aircraft that I'll never get the chance to. But when I can bounce things off of so many, and we're talking about aviation here specifically,
Sure.
It's so powerful. But if I didn't have that, there are 100% mistakes I know I would have made, or things I would have said that I wish I could take back because I didn't have that. So if you have those trusted mentors around you, I think it helps. And if you can, be that for someone else. You never know how you're going to help them.
And, there's I'm going to plug another podcast on your podcast. That's okay.
Send it.
Flying Magazine has a podcast called I Learned About Flying from That. And I think about the times in flying when I learned about life from that is kind of the corollary to that, what those guys put out. And absolutely, those are all aviation lessons. And then just you can apply them broader to life, to like surround yourself with good aviators who think about this stuff in their off time, right? Who put effort in, and maybe some people who are a little philosophical about how to do things right in life too. And I'll tell you what, I encourage everyone to go look into Stoicism. It's having like kind of a resurgence right now. And so there's kind of this like pop Stoicism and like self-help movement kind of stuff. And I'm not super into that, but the classic philosophy, I can't think of anything better for a pilot to study besides the actual physical manipulation of an airplane. The airplane is coming apart around you. And what are you going to do? Well, you can't let your emotions take control, right? You can't panic. You've got to be in control of yourself. And then these could be your final moments. Maybe not. But if you fight all the way to the ground, you either save yourself in the plane or you literally die trying. But like your last moments on Earth were purposeful. I honestly don't know right now if I'm talking metaphorically or literally, because it is the perfect life lesson, I think, for everyone, but for pilots especially. I've got to imagine that these old Greek dudes had pilots in mind when they were thinking about this, because it just seems so perfect. You hear these guys on, declaring an emergency on ATC, or you hear cockpit voice recorders, right? Just chill as hell while the world comes apart around them. That's what I strive to be.
We joke about the airplane will fly itself. In some cases, good Lord, the automation, it literally will fly itself out of gas, and even all the way to the scene of the crash after that, right? What we get paid as aviators, as pilots, to do is not the monkey skill, so to speak, and the ability to take all that information and, like you said, remain stoic, let's say, and make a good decision with it. And if you can't learn from others, if you can't hear other people's stories, and it's funny because some of those podcasts I listen to, some people will tell stories, and it's funny to hear their takeaways, Vice. Maybe with a little bit, I have just shy of 3,000 hours, so not that much, even close to some of the real experts out there. But it's like, I don't know if the lesson you learned from that is the lesson maybe I'm going to take away from it. But again, every little look, every little touch, I'll relate it back to something at the squadron that I fly with. We're doing a syllabus change. We're talking about, thankfully, we're going to use the same amount of hours, but going to train our backseaters a little bit differently. And that was the first thing that several of us stood up and said is, whatever the syllabus change is, faster, funnier, whatever efficiencies we want to bring, we better not take away flight time, because every opportunity that you get, every pre-flight, every time you walk out to the airplane, if you're paying attention, you're learning something. Locking that in, and it's going to make you a better aviator. And I hope people take that same attitude, because, if not, it's to your detriment, I guess I'd say. Anyway, we're way off the rails, so we'll get back to airplanes and flying. But thank you for taking us there and telling the story. After McConnell, where did you go? Where could you have gone? I guess I should say first. Where'd you go next?
At one point, I considered resigning my commission and taking an Army warrant commission, because they were willing to let me fly helicopters. Mildly ashamed to say that I just didn't think I could manage the pay cut. That was my biggest concern. But the real determining factor ended up being is that they decided that they wanted basically a test case of divesting navigators. And so I was not being modest when I said that the tanker assignments were not glorious assignments to get out of UCT. You had to have, and again, going back to the attitude thing and how you handle your situation, I walked myself into a tanker by my own devices. So they wanted someone to go to another airframe. So they were going to send guys off one by one to go to different airframes. I had friends who went to F-15s. I have no idea how that went. I had guys that went to MC-130s. I know of myself and two other people that went to U-28s with AFSOC. I was the first one to leave McConnell to crossflow to another platform. That was what sealed the deal for me, is when they said, hey, where do you want to go? Any aircraft with a CISO? you can go. So just let us know what you want. Or if you're going to go bail for the Army, just let us know that. And they were like, in typical Air Force fashion, like, you have a week, figure it out. Also, you're deploying like 2 weeks now.
No pressure.
Yeah, right. So I chose the U-28. I wish I could remember my deliberation process a little better. It just seemed at the time like a very, very dark project aircraft. It is not that dark, but just seemed very up close and personal with some of the joint partners that we work with. And I am using the official lingo for a reason there. So it was very appealing to me. Prior to my divorce, I had married into a family. My father-in-law was Lieutenant Colonel Bucky Burris, Lewis Bucky Burris. He was the very first deputy commander of Delta when they stood up. So super intrigued by that community. And I thought getting closer to that world would be something I was interested in. I had had a chance to see how AFSOC worked and how SOCOM worked when I was sitting in the JOC. And it was incredibly impressive and very tip of the spear and, not necessarily aircraft, but just the missions in general. And, there's a little bit of intrigue there too, because it's all classified and all that stuff. So they sent me down to Hurlburt Field. I spent 8 months getting qualified as a CISO in the U-28. And then they, the dreaded assignment came. They assigned me to Cannon Air Force Base in Clovis, New Mexico, which for those who don't know is on the border of western Texas in New Mexico. It's about equidistant between Lubbock and Amarillo, Texas. So that was...
The ranges are great, I'm told. That's what people talk about, like for Fallon or maybe El Centro. The people talk about the airspace is great, and what they're trying to say is that there's not a lot going on the ground or for the family or anyone else.
Very true.
The airspace is wonderful.
Yeah, and the flying weather's generally pretty decent too. But there is not. I think deserts are pretty. It's an attractive landscape. Scrub brush, not so much. So Clovis was a hard assignment. While I was there, I married my wife, so it wasn't all bad. And we had a married couple living with roommates. We had a house that was kind of a party house, and we had a couple roommates, and we made the best of it. But yeah, so I went out to the 318th Special Operations Squadron out there and deployed twice in the U-28, and then got to come back to Hurlburt a couple years ago.
For those that are unfamiliar with the U-28, and we're going to speak broadly here. Pilatus PC-12, just I'm going to say missionized or
militarized. Is in the official literature.
One of my first, I have 2 U-28 stories. One I cannot tell on the podcast. I'll tell you later. The other one I definitely can. The little airport where I keep my airplane here in Pensacola is called Ferguson. 82 Juliet's technically been renamed now, but we'll call it Ferguson for the podcast because it'll always be Ferguson in my heart.
Sure.
Grass runway and then a little asphalt kind of hard surface runway parallel to one another. And going out there working on the airplane one day, and there's this giant airplane doing touch and goes, and they touch and goes. They would land, roll out to the end, taxi back, and for about 2 hours, I got some of the coolest video of a U-28 doing bounces there in the grass. Fresh cut grass. You get, as they fly by, you get these beautiful vortices. But the reason I mention that is you're not seeing KC-135s at a 3,000-ish foot, grass runway. Yeah. U-28s. I'm guessing there's other stuff out there that can do it, but it's that I'm guessing mission set where there's maybe not a giant runway or a runway at all, or all the services and support assets that you might have at a larger airfield. But there's a reason why the airplane is designed to succeed in that environment, I guess we'll say.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that was appealing about the U-28 and that I still love about it is that how formalized military flying is and how you're always IFR everywhere you go. Maybe not on the helicopter, but...
I follow roads, IFR.
So it's very GA-like sometimes. We fly a lot of VFR or a lot of outside of the control of air traffic. So it feels like GA flying sometimes. So you were asking the mission. The U-28, nicknamed Draco, it was essentially conceived in the early 2000s in response to the insurgency in Iraq, where we were going with kind of this attack the network strategy. It's a tactical ISR platform. So essentially we're locating targets for SOCOMs removed from the battlefield list. So we get up over a target. It's find, fix, finish, right? So we find them, fix their routine and their living space and all that. And then there's the finish. It's either coordinating for an airstrike, and this is kind of our favorite role and where we have the most connection is that we will sit up overhead and provide live intelligence for a ground force that's going to move in and capture kill one of these targets. So I like to think of us at that point as a police helicopter kind of. So we're up over top with the radio, and we've got 2 cameras. They're both EOIR, electro-optical infrared, so full color camera or infrared camera. Got some lasers. One of the guys who introduced me to the community initially said our job is to stand over the battlefield and emphatically point at things. So massive communication suite, 13 different radios essentially, satellite and line of sight, plenty of other antennas sticking off of the airplane too. The unique thing about us is that our co-pilots are sensor operators also. Once you're at a safe altitude, their pilot job goes away. They literally pull out a keyboard and a hand controller for an MX-15 sensor ball, and they become a subordinate sensor to the CISO. We can do stack management. So what we call TAC A, if you're familiar with forward air control airborne, this is tactical air control airborne. And it's everything that a FAC A does except for clearing the release of weapons. We say that it's brief, which is telling everyone in the stack what the situation is. Stack management, which is deconflicting by altitude and airspace. Mark, which is marking targets. We have a laser designator. And then the last one would be clearance. We take brief stack mark from the JTAC if that's what they want. So that's one of the services that we provide. And then we're reach back too, because they're in a bowl in Afghanistan, mountains on all sides. They can't get a line of sight radio out. We can be up there with a SATCOM or a long range line of sight. It's a varied mission set. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I think I've tap danced around anything.
You have. You've done great. Okay. Well, I got some more questions if that's all right.
Sure.
But what you're describing, building a stack, working with not even just Air Force assets, assets from all services, potentially other entities, right? It is incredibly challenging. You're describing, I would argue, some of the most challenging things that aviators do. And no one is just, I would say human beings are not a light switch. You just don't flip the light switch and you go from no experience and no knowledge to all of a sudden being someone that is really good at this mission set. It's maybe more like a dimmer. You're going to slowly bring the volume up. For folks that are from outside that community, they just see people that are really, really good at it. And that's how you talked about the 160th, right? I have a couple friends that have lived that life or are currently living that life, and they are some of the best pilots in the world. But what I also know is I know them, and I know their background. I know they didn't just get there in one flash. They got there through a lot of steps. For someone that is, again, outside this world that says, you know what, maybe I want to be a U-28 CISO. I want to be a U-28 pilot. I want to be a U-28 crew member of some other form or fashion. How do you get there? What's the path? Because you're seeing it from the side of what's up, how to do it. What does it take for someone to get to sit in your seat one day?
Once you get to the formal training unit for the U-28, as a CISO, you jump right into mission stuff. You're going to get right into the basics of intelligence gathering from the air. Imagery intelligence is basically what you're doing. And man, our job is so much technique and very little procedure is the reality. You get new guys who come in and they're like looking at a target, a guy walking around, they relay to, during training, I wouldn't let it get this far in real life. They were like, hey, I've positively identified weapons on this adult male walking here. I'm like, that's a radio. I'm like, how do you know?
Yeah.
I'm like, well, because I've been doing it for a while.
Yeah.
It's developing an eye for it. It's a lot of patience and collecting your thoughts and letting a situation develop until just that right point where you're providing updates frequently enough, but not providing partial information by trying to rush to say something. So if you're going to be a U-28 CISO and you're in training, that's kind of who I'm imagining I'm talking to here, is a guy that's about to walk into the formal training unit. It's about communicating with clarity and don't outkick your coverage as far as like your abilities. If you can't identify something, don't force it. You're looking through a camera at the ground, especially in IR. It's exposure learning only. You have to see an AK-47 in IR 400 times before you can see one confidently and be like, I know exactly what that is. Or the same thing with the radio or something like that. And there's a cross-check involved too, much like a pilot would have scanning instruments, right? We'll follow a vehicle in the daylight, right? And you're looking at it and it's like, all right, 4 people get out of this vehicle. We are down to the level where we need to know what seat were they in? What seat was each one of them in? And what does each one of them look like? It's SA management, just like anything else is. It's funny that we look at, do you need airmanship to be a sensor operator? And intuitively, you'd say, no, what's that matter? Well, it's the same skill set, though. It's that rapid acquisition of information and keeping your eyes moving. And yeah, I think those are the big ones, is communication and then the developing the techniques through exposure.
You've also said, I'm going to project a little bit on what you said. I think that's a great answer. You also described just doing it. I'm assuming maybe there is a simulator, maybe there's not. There is. Okay. But there's probably no substitute for doing the mission, going out and practicing in the actual airplane with the actual sensors. Nope. And the reason I mention that is I have some friends, and if they listen to this, they know who I'm talking to. I think it's just the way the younger generation is, right? They're very much, if I on my phone, I found it on the internet, and everything seems very real because it's written, or I found a photo of it, or I found an explanation of it. And sometimes they'll kind of take things as you describe, that's the truth, that's a verified thing. And I'm a very big believer that it might be, but you yourself need to go out and have those experiences, because that's the way you're going to be good at whatever job. In this case, we're talking about military aviation, but that's how you're going to actually understand how these things work.
There used to be this notion in our community, and we were a lot more selectively manned at one point than we are now. And so we grew up with kind of this, hey, if you got a weak guy, don't send him on exercise. We want to build confidence in our capabilities, and so we don't want to put this guy in front of one of the teams quite yet. He needs a little more seasoning. And I think rightfully so, we've kind of gotten away from that. We're very much more like, no, this dude needs first exposure. This is the theory behind Red Flag, right? Is that your first 6 combat missions or however many, it's the same thing. I need you to do this with a real team, with real gunfire noise over the radio, in person at least once, if not multiple times, before I send you downrange. And so we used to kind of like ease people into, you'd only get development lines, which are where you're just developing the intel. You're not going to be leading a team in. You're probably not going to be bringing in kinetic assets or anything like that. You're just following the dude, right? In reality, what that means is that for every hour that we get to follow somebody, there's probably 100 hours of us staring at a building where nothing moves, right? So in case anybody thought that I glamorized the job too much, there's the ground truth. That's what you need to get used to being the FDU is, can you keep your attention on something when it is incredibly boring, when there's nothing going on? The minute you look away, Murphy's Law says that dude's going to walk out and do something, right? So we send these guys now for exposure therapy, essentially. Like, you have to go, and you're going to suck. You're going to suck the first time you try and cover a direct action mission. The first time you do that, it's terrible for everyone. You may have done it 1,000,000 times in the simulator. You may have done it 100 times with a rehearsed ground force that, play actors, essentially, which is what we use for training. But it's never going to be the same as a real team kicking in real doors. And so we'll try and get you the reps.
But it's the only place that growth comes from, is that uncomfortable feeling. I think folks, no matter what they might say, and some people are very good at wearing the mask, acting like they know what they're doing, fake it till you make it, so to speak. At the end of the day, at your core, these folks, when you're new, you know when you suck.
Yeah.
You know when you have to improve. And don't worry, in a high-performing organization, I'm guessing they're going to let you know through formal and informal ways as well, the other members of your team, right? But you have to have that feeling in the pit of your stomach to then look inside and say, you know what, I'm going to be better at this. Yeah. I'm going to do whatever it takes. I'm going to learn from others. I'm going to work as part of that team. Right. And then you do get good at it over time.
And every ground force I've ever worked with, they have students too. They weren't born knowing how to put every shot in the 10 ring every single time.
Call this breaking news. What do you, what? Yes, tell me more secrets, really.
No one was born knowing how to make perfect headshots from the skid of a helicopter.
Yeah, that surprises me. I thought never mind. Well, there you go. I learned something today.
I'm a big fan of the magician Pendulette, just his theory on life. And he has this moment that he talks about and we are very far afield now.
We'll get back, I'm sure. Don't worry.
He talks about this moment he had when he got a hold of he's a huge music buff. He got a hold of a Beatles bootleg. And up to this point, he thought that genius was just innate. And so he assumed that his favorite artists like Bob Dylan and the Beatles, they would go into the studio and they would just hammer out the tunes. It just flowed from them. They were born knowing how to do it. And he discovered some notebooks of Bob Dylan's that had scribbles and scratches and things that he crossed out, and same song written 10 different ways. And then he got a Beatles bootleg where they were screwing up and making fun of one another. And he was just like, that's when it hit him that, and the way he likes to say it is, genius is a thing that lazy people say because they didn't work hard enough. And I think that's absolutely how it works with these guys and with us too, is that no one was born knowing how to run a sensor. No one was born knowing how to kick indoors. We're all learning together.
So I already kind of alluded to it, Ryan, but we'll get back to it just because I want to make sure I hammer the point home. In that KC-135, pretty good air conditioning, and there's room for, I think there's a galley, right? Like, you're pretty well taken care of.
There's a toaster oven on the KC-135.
I mean, in the 53, we peed in Gatorade bottles. So anyway, all I'm getting at, a little bit of creature comforts. Yeah. But in the U-28, maybe a step in the different direction, right? You're living in challenging places, and it's a great aircraft, right? But you're not flying back necessarily to a beautiful air base. I guess it's just a different environment. I was hoping maybe you could tell me about some of the challenges.
So there were some bigger bases that we were at. I'm sure some Google Earth imagery could probably show you where we were. But then my last deployment, I was on a FOB. I mean, the way that you literally think of a FOB, or a forward operating base, we had a concrete runway, and that was about it. There was Alaska shelters. It was all, I lived in a tent. The roads were pretty much dirt. The gym was a big giant tent. And then the HESCO barriers were the perimeter. That was it. It was us and then wild, location redacted, outside of the HESCO barriers, which HESCO barriers are just, it's a cage with a burlap sack in it filled with sand or dirt. And that was it. And gun positions and armed guards all the time, like really armed guards, not like gate guards. So yeah, it's very different. And the minute that you take off, you are over enemy territory. You're in enemy territory the whole time. You know, you live there. Some of our locations have been attacked before. Luckily, we bed down with some of the baddest MFers in the galaxy, so they're pretty good at repelling that. But it's not quite roughing it in the truest sense. You know, we still had showers. Like I said, a gym and a mess hall, but very small locations for sure.
The way you're describing it to me, I know you're not selling me on the idea, but you are kind of, right, on AFSOC. It sounds like it is a challenge. It's kind of one of those, we're going to throw down the gauntlet. You're going to maybe have some challenging work conditions, but you're going to bring bring so much value to the Air Force, to these other entities you work with, to the United States, right?
Sure.
And so it sounds like it attracts a certain kind of person, which is a great thing, and retains a certain kind of person too, right? Because it is very, very challenging. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, we want aggressive people. Our community was founded by fighter pilots and RIOs, actually. So our earliest guys were Navy RIOs that had left the F-14. They didn't know what to do with them. So they became backseaters in the U-28. My job was originally done by guys in the Navy. There are still some guys that teach at the schoolhouse as civilians that are former F-15 backseaters. So yeah, a touch of the fighter culture in us, not a whole lot.
Can you make jalapeno popcorn? That's the only question I got to ask.
It's can I or do we?
Either one you want to answer.
I can. It's been a long time. It's been about a decade.
You would not think of the 53 as a place that jalapeno popcorn is like in our community, but one of my greatest joys, and this is going to sound really dumb, was making good corn. I think y'all call it corn in the Air Force, but making good jalapeno popcorn and sharing it.
Yeah.
And if you make it bad, it's like a chemical weapon when you put too much of the, it's just... Some of my greatest memories are in that wardroom in HM-15, enjoying it with my friends after flying.
Yeah. Well, and I'm the guy because I'm big on tradition and things like that. I'm the guy that walks around like, where's the corn? Somebody find me a lieutenant. So we do it. We do corn.
If you make good corn, you're going to be fine. Like there's really nothing else. If you solve that, you're going to be fine.
Yeah. And that's what the guys don't understand, man. This is why I get onto them. Like, if you can do this, there's a checklist and everything.
I like it. Well, see, for us, it was a little bit more of a dealer's choice. You'd kind of learn, hey, wow, you made a little bit too much chemical agent in here. Okay. Maybe clean out the wardroom and you'll learn again. I like the checklist. That's probably the better way to do it.
It does not prevent chemical warfare. It does not prevent that.
That is very fair. So actually, Ryan, a lot of people don't always necessarily know the way I meet my guests. One of the ways that we met is general aviation. So I've got an RV-6, you've got an RV-8. I know there's a little bit of a story behind you, general aviation, and that airplane specifically.
Yeah. So like I said, I got my private certificate when I was in college right before I went off to UPT. And it took a while to shake off the falling off the bike thing. And once I kind of had my shift in mindset, one of the first things I did was dove back in. So I got my instrument rating in 2018 and barely 6 months later went out and took some time off work and did my commercial. And I have managed to swing some permissive TUI. And the reason I have time for this interview is because I am in the midst of doing my multi add-on for that. We got to pick up CFI immediately afterwards. But yeah, back when I was in Clovis, Clovis is close enough by air to a lot of things that are really fun. Denver, Dallas. I mean, Albuquerque's not bad, but Santa Fe is beautiful. So I've always wanted to own an airplane, and suddenly there was reason to do it. And the RV-8, I can't believe that airplane exists. It seems like it breaks all the rules of like, you can be fast or efficient or fun, pick two, right? And it does all three. And so I just started looking, and I'd actually had a deal fall out from under me because the guy didn't want to authorize a pre-buy on the airplane. And I told him if he didn't let me do it, I wasn't going to buy it. Just a little after like 6 months of searching, I even flew out while I was doing my commercial training. One of my cross countries was to go inspect this airplane myself. Now I wanted an A&P to do it, but he said no and ended up selling it to someone else. And I was kind of dejected. And a buddy of mine from Wichita, which is where the first plane was located, incidentally, he sent me a picture of an ad on the countertop at the FBO where his flight school was located. It said RV-8 for sale. A picture of an RV-8 and it had a phone number. He's like, I know you were just up here, but I don't know, maybe somebody heard you. And this guy hadn't posted it anywhere online. I looked. Older guy, just wasn't interested in it. So I called him. And this dude is just the coolest guy I've ever met. He wanted somebody to have this plane who would use it so bad that when I made my opening gambit, and I'm going to be honest with you, I lowballed him. He talked me down 3 times. He called me back 3 times to say that he asked for too much money. He tried to do it a 4th time, and I knew that he had kids. And I said, not jokingly and not as cruel humor or anything, I said, sir, your son is going to come after me for elder abuse if I take this plane from you. So I got an RV-8 for $35,000.
My Lord, that is, there are engines for that airplane that you couldn't find for $35K.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So I was highly motivated to buy at that point.
I would have been too.
His name is Bobby Newsom. He's a Vietnam War vet. He flew A4s for the Marine Corps and became a test pilot. And then when he retired from the Marine Corps, he got hired by Beechcraft. And he was the lead test pilot for the T-6A Texan II. So he developed that airplane, and he wrote a book called Pig Eye. I don't know where it's available. I bet Amazon. Man, it is a tome. It's a good 3 inches thick. And I mean, he's not famous in any way or anything like that. He says up front in the book, he wrote it so his kids could read it. Ended up getting published somehow. But phenomenal life story. Just super interesting. He was an orphan grew up in a group home all the way up until he left to commission. If I remember the story correctly, he enlisted first as an infantryman and then ended up commissioning from there. And I still want to say that he commissioned not as an aviator, or he went into aviation after he had already done some other stuff. But his RV-8 was painted like A4 Skyhawk, that gray to white underbelly, and it's got his carrier's tail flash on it, or I should say it did until about a week ago. We'll talk about that. So it was a beautiful airplane. I did start to feel after 3 years like I couldn't fly a Marine Corps airplane around anymore. It was a little too many ramp guys at FBOs asked me if I was still in the Marine Corps, and I was like, as much as I would love to leave this plane the way that he gave it to me, it's starting to be a little like lateral stolen valor for me. So a week ago, I delivered it to a gentleman up in Alabama to have it repainted. All the aluminum is going to be stripped and restored, and I'm going to polish it because I'm a glutton for punishment.
Clearly, yes, sir. Each one of those surfaces has two sides you have to polish.
I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. That's awesome.
So hopefully the metal can be restored. We'll find out here in a little bit.
Okay. Thought maybe you were going to go with a U-28 paint scheme or something. So.
I thought
KC-135.
I thought about it, but just gray on white or gray on, the Shamu paint job has a little wave in it, I guess. That's what we call the Special Operations paint job. And I'm not going to do the typical RV-8 thing. No stars and bars, no invasion stripes, none of that. It's just going to be metal and one color. So the fiberglass and the canopy rail on all that will have highlights on it. But it's going to be that shape of the P-51 Mustang paint scheme. So where it arcs up off the nose cowling and around the canopy skirt and then the wingtips. Pretty much anything fiberglass. So polished aluminum, and then that and the color, I found the actual service standard from 1947 for the Chance Fock Corsair, my grandfather's airplane. And I found that, that high gloss blue, we're looking at a picture of it right now, actually, but that really high gloss, very dark navy, that's going to be the highlight color on the airplane.
That's awesome.
So, and then my name was going to go on the left canopy rail in the pilot seat, and my grandfather's is going to go on the right canopy rail on the pilot seat. I have a pin-up design for it as well. I contracted an artist, Victory Girls, out in California. I feel like I'm kind of advertising on your show.
It's fine. Send it. I like it.
But Jerry out at Victory Girls does really good work. I just got the first proof of it the other day. So she's going to be called the Satin Doll, which is a Duke Ellington song. So I decided a while back that every plane that I own is going to be named after a song somewhere. So just kind of an ode to my other love in life, which is music.
That's super cool. And I think this is one thing that does honestly make me sad is a lot of military aviators that I know don't necessarily either have the time, chance, or just even the ability to have that appreciation for general aviation.
Some of them are scared of it.
That's true. That's a different conversation.
Yeah, I think it's dangerous.
And it's some of the greatest aviators I know are in the military, right? And some of the greatest aviators I know are civilian pilots as well that have never touched military aircraft. Yeah. I think both could learn from the other. And it really does make me sad when people look down on, and honestly on the Navy side, it even starts maybe here in Pensacola where people talk about bug smashers or Billy Bob in a Cessna.
Yeah.
Billy Bob in a Cessna might have 20,000 hours of flight time and could outfly your instructor pilot in that little T6 that you're raging around in. You don't know. And it's just it's an interesting dichotomy to me that some of the greatest memories in my life, I flew home to get married in my RV-6, in my airplane. I brought my wife back to Norfolk in my airplane. Some of the really most wonderful memories happen because of aviation or general aviation.
Yeah.
And I just want to share that with others. I'm so glad. It's just nice to find another military aviator that has that appreciation, has that kind of respect and understanding for it as well.
Oh, yeah. My wife had never been up in an airplane before. I took her in a Cessna at one point, and then we go places in the RV. I flew her back with the airplane when I delivered it home.
Oh, wow.
So I brought her with me.
A lot of trust. I love it.
Yeah, I scared the hell out of her for more than a few times, I'm sure.
Hopefully the trust continues to grow. That's
yeah,
awesome.
So she said if I ever turn it upside down with her in a divorce.
There you go.
So she's never gone aerobatic yet.
89 degrees right there. Just as soon as you break 90.
Yeah.
Do you actually have parachutes for it? I don't have any for my airplane. It is aerobatic, obviously, but it's never something I've chased.
I have one for myself, which you don't need it if you're a single pilot. But I have on the shopping list after the paint job are a seat chute for the front seat and then an actual backpack chute for the back seat because I really do enjoy aerobatics. I actually want to compete with it. I'm going to start working on that. I work on it now. I'm going to probably commit to it here in the next little bit.
Okay, Ryan, as we kind of wrap up, I always like to talk about what's next or what's the future, the OA1K. A lot of folks are probably not going to maybe immediately recognize that acronym or what that airplane is, but you get to be part of the future of Air Force Special Operations Command and that airplane. So I was hoping maybe you could tell us about that.
Sure. So a call went out a few months ago now that they were looking for volunteers to form the initial cadre for the Air Force's latest program. And so I think a lot of people are probably familiar with Light Attack, which was the armed T6 or the Super Tucano. There were some other competitors that weren't publicized as much, and one of them was the AT-802 air tractor, which is a crop duster. And there's several companies that do it. I think the one that competed for light attack was the IOMAX Archangel, and then L3 made one as well. I don't remember what they call theirs. We call it the Combat Crop Duster for now. It doesn't have a name yet. But so when ACC, Air Combat Command, dropped the light attack program, AFSOC picked it up, and then it transformed through various machinations and some funny history, I'm sure, into the Armed Overwatch program. So AFSOC wants a forward-firing CAS platform, and SOCOM does too, for that matter. So the call went out, and I got picked up to form the initial cadre. So probably around this time next year, we're going to move out to wherever they're going to place the formal training unit for that, and we'll be flying an armed crop duster.
T6, I know there were some, actually the Air Force bought some AT6 airframes, and the only reason I mentioned that, I don't think it's a secret, I know one went back to Beechcraft, and a good friend sent me photos of that airplane going to Naval Test Pilot School, I guess.
Oh, okay.
I know, somehow Navy to Air Force, Air Force to Navy, I should say, that transition happened, and that airplane's going to live a new life, but painted up almost like an A1 SPAD or something.
Yeah.
Beautiful looking airplane. There were A29s that I've seen flying around the area. There were a couple of gray ones that popped into Hattiesburg, Mississippi one day.
They're over at Hurlburt.
Okay, yeah. So there you go. So these airplanes have been kind of in the ether, but the one that won was essentially an armed air tractor.
Yes. Yeah. And the A29s at Hurlburt are part of the Air Advisor program.
Oh, really? Okay.
They're part of what we call aviation fit or foreign internal defense. Those are going away. They're going to get rid of them. I believe that there's 2 of them at Hurlburt, and there are like 2 pilots at Hurlburt.
Really? I must have seen those 2 pilots in those 2 airplanes.
And that's exactly what it is. It's like these 2 dudes just have their own parking space and their own airplanes.
Wow.
They just go. And that's what I honestly don't know how many pilots there are, but it seems that way.
But you mentioned we don't have a force laydown. We don't know how many airplanes yet, where they're going to go, or do we have any ideas on that?
I'm hesitant to say because I don't want to get it, not because it's sensitive, because I don't want to get it wrong.
We just don't know.
It was like 70 aircraft, I think, or something like that.
Okay.
So the plan is to replace the U-28 with them, as well as the Oklahoma Guard MC-12s, which basically do the same mission as us.
So it'll be a Guard unit and then an active duty unit.
Yes.
All within AFSOC, though.
Correct. And I believe the plan right now, subject to change, is that the Guard unit, they will kind of be the steward of the formal training unit and will be total force integration TFI, so active duty alongside the Guard teaching there.
And I want to say that's Will Rogers Airport up there in Oklahoma.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
So it won't be at Tinker. It'll actually be, if the plan continues as it's currently laid out, it'll be up at Oklahoma City.
Any word on what's going to be hung off the airplane? You talked about forward firing, so I'm guessing maybe a gun, rockets potentially, free fall bombs, or laser guided.
So of course L3 comes out with their whole spread. Right now, the only thing that the Air Force is laser focused on is forward firing advanced precision kill weapon systems, APKWS, the rockets, laser guided rockets, AGR-20s. That's going to be its bread and butter. That's like what they want the plane to use primarily, but it's got laser designators on it, and there's a plan for laser guided bombs, the ubiquitous Hellfire, I'm sure. And then I don't know, have you ever seen a common launch tube before?
I've not, no.
So a common launch tube is the gunships use them. They sit vertically in the tail. It's got a missile in it that comes out tail first. It's spring loaded. It just like pops it down, and then the rocket motors ignite, so you can shoot a AGM-176 or a GBU-69 out of those. So either a glide bomb or an actual low collateral rocket. They're both very low collateral weapons. They come in tubes, so if you can imagine kind of like the old Apaches, how they had tubes of something, I can't remember what they put in them, but they had like a quad rail of tubes. So they're looking at quad rails to go on the hard points for this, but it carries an astonishing amount of weight for what it is.
And fuel as well.
Yeah, and it's got self-sealing fuel tanks, and now I'm just an advertisement for L3, but it can pretty much carry, I would imagine it would be capable of carrying most anything in the inventory, weight permitting.
We're talking about 2 people, right? Someone up front, someone in the back.
Yeah, so right now it's pilot and CISO. I'm fighting very hard for them to call it a Wizzo in the back seat.
Heck yeah.
And 2 independent sensors that are roll-on, roll-off essentially, or bolt-on, bolt-off for the hard, so they're hard point sensors. MX-20s, I think, is what they want to use, which is a 20-inch sensor. Well, they're big, so it's going to be a drag monster for sure. Like, it's going to be very draggy. Fixed gear, tailwheel.
Tailwheel,
Air
I was going to get to
first
that.
tailwheel since 1947 or something like that.
Really?
I think, yeah.
A1 Skyraider, I'm trying to think of the last, like what was in the inventory.
Oh, you're right. The Skyraider was a tail dragger.
Probably the Skyraider.
Yeah, it had to have been, and that was through
Vietnam.
60s, late 60s probably.
I'm very curious how you're going to build how the Air Force is going to build a cadre of tailwheel pilots. And I have it in my brain, I don't know, a bunch of Satabrias or something and then step up, or you're going to train them in the air tractor, maybe a slick air tractor.
So the last I heard is it's essentially go get your civilian tailwheel rating. The Air Force is going to pay for that. And then there's going to be like, they were talking about light tailwheel, then medium tailwheel, then heavy tailwheel. And I asked the question, what's a medium tailwheel? I can't think of one, Like to me, the air tractor would be a medium tailwheel with a heavy tailwheel being like a DC-3.
Agreed.
But maybe a Beech 18 or something?
Yeah, and I know at least friends that have flown air tractors, the challenge there are very springy gear. And so based on if you're in a light air tractor, it's going to be a little bit more gentlemanly. If you're in a heavy airplane, if you get any kind of a bounce in there, the airplane's going to throw you that gear is going to throw you right back into the air.
Okay.
Now we're talking about the friends of mine that do this crop dusting, right? So there's stuff under the airplane, but not ordnance, not heavy stuff.
Right.
It's the tanks are heavy, but the tanks are centerline as opposed to now you have things on weapon stations, and what if one goes but the other doesn't? There's a whole lot of potential for learning there, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And you did hit on something. You said you, but not you. Actually, us. There's no ejection seat. So right now, the rumor is, and it's a slightly more substantiated than just a rumor, is that CISOs are going to have to know how to land the airplane because you can't get out any other way.
No way.
The thing's built like a tank. It's got a roll cage. I'm not particularly worried about the ejection for like a landing crash or something like that, or a ground loop. I've seen a lot of videos of AT-802 crashes that were like very survivable because of the roll cage. But what I am worried about is if I can't get out of the airplane, I need to know how to put it on the ground.
That's awesome that mentality is baked into the cake, hopefully, from day one.
Yeah, that's part of the reason that some of the CISOs that were selected for it were, I've got 200 hours of tailwheel time and climbing, and so does one of the other guys that got picked up for it as well. So they're looking for that as part of the initial cadre thing. They want to see like, hey, let's ease the CISOs into it, maybe start with some tailwheel guys, and then we'll see if the general population can do it. Yeah,
like you said, there's nothing to step up from in the Air Force at all. This is going to be a brand, in terms of a tailwheel perspective, right? Everyone's learning in a T6 as a pilot, and a T6 is not a tailwheel airplane. So
yeah, and
our modern T6, I should say.
Right, and AFSOC is going to start taking guys directly from T6s now.
Really?
So no more advanced phase for AFSOC flyers.
Interesting.
In fact, I say they're going to, as of this month, I believe the first aviators have arrived at Hurlburt for formal training units that have only flown the T6.
That is awesome. In some ways, that is terrifying in some ways. What I hope is
as a guy without a yoke in front of him, that's terrifying.
Very fair. I guess what I would say is this. I know that the old salts, as we would say in the Navy, the folks that are experienced like you, are going to keep a really close eye on that. And that's what's going to keep people safe. Because, again, we talked about it earlier, right? People that you can trust, people that can give you that direct feedback, and hopefully give the organization that feedback as well. Hey, this experiment is going great. Hey, we need more resources or more help or more something, here, and let's fix it and adjust fire. And it's the only way to get better. Ryan, I end these all the same way. I'm going to start them all the same way as well. But I always, first off, want to say a little bit of gratitude and say thank you for taking so much time, sharing your stories. But also, you get the last word. Anything maybe I didn't ask you or anything you want to say? Over to you.
Thank you for having me as well. I like to talk and I like to hear myself talk. So I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to prattle on for a bit. I guess my big focus these days, I just finished the aircraft mishap investigation course and safety program for the Air Force. I'm doing flight safety stuff now, kind of dovetailing off what you're saying about keeping an eye on people. I think to the aviators listening out there, the force is getting younger right now, and we're becoming a very inexperienced force from my point of view. And I think that GA attitude of I do this because I love it and I want to spend my time even out of the office doing the thing, right? Because that builds knowledge and experience. I think we need to discover that again in the military. And I know it's a job and it's a grind, but I really long for a cadre of aviators that are going to rededicate them to the art. And I've always thought that the natural talent of an aviator isn't really a thing. At least I don't feel like it's a thing for me. I don't feel like a naturally talented aviator at all. And maybe there are some people out there who are like that. But to me, the guys who are the best are the ones who love it so much that they can't put it down, that they can't stop consuming information about it, even when, I go up to the hangar when the plane's gone and just sit there and read something and just put myself in that headspace. And it's like, it's a cliche at this point, the good aviator is always learning, right? But it's so true. We just need more people who love it so much that they can't stop.
Thanks, as always, for taking the time and tuning in to Safe on Deck. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It shouldn't need to be said, but just in case, I'll say it. The views and opinions presented on Safe on Deck are my own and those of my guests, and do not represent the official policy or position of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or its components. Be well, blue skies, and fly safe out there. See you next time. PC idle, wings level, play over Safe on Deck.